And we are live. Hey, everybody. I'm Robert Douglas from Platform.sh, and this is episode 2 of Deploy Friday. Of course, we're all joining you from our homes, safely quarantined around the world, streaming from Cologne, Paris, New York, San Francisco, and Florida. We've got a number of great guests today to talk about headless CMS, including Strapi.io, Drupal, Oracle Content and Experience, in collaboration with Gatsby.js. So let's meet the guests. First of all, from Gatsby, we've got Dustin Schau. Hey, Dustin, introduce yourself.
Hey, yeah, glad to be here. I'm head of product at Gatsby. Started as a software engineer, and really excited to talk about Gatsby and why I think it's the way to build for the web.
Thanks. And from Oracle, we have Preston. So,
hi, everybody. I'm Preston. So, such a pleasure to be here. Thanks to Platform.sh for hosting this. I'm Senior Director of Product Strategy at Oracle. I'm also Editor-in-Chief at Tag One Consulting, a well-known Drupal agency, as well as author of the book Decoupled, Drupal and Experience, the only comprehensive guide to decoupled Drupal across the stack.
And from Strapi.io, we have Pierre Burgy. But Pierre, would you say your name properly for me?
Burgy is fine.
Thank you.
It was perfect. So, hi everyone. I am Pierre. I run one of the creators of Strapi, which is the leading open source headless CMS, and I am the CEO of the company behind the open source project.
Great, thank you. And I brought along a colleague today from Platform.sh, Chad Carlson. Introduce yourself, please.
Hey everyone, I'm Chad. I'm a technical writer for the developer relations team at Platform.sh, and I've gotten the opportunity to play a lot with these technologies in the last few months.
And with that, thank you. I'm going to simply hand it over to Chad, who's going to run the show from here on out, because Chad knows way more than I do about any of these technologies. So Chad, what are we talking about today?
Thanks, Rob. So our title for today is Gatsby headless CMS, including Strapi, Drupal, and Oracle Content and Experience. Today, really talking about Gatsby and headless content management systems and how taking this approach is changing the direction of web development towards decoupling application resources to these specialized services that are loaded into something like Gatsby through source plugins, as opposed to this more traditional centralized monolithic approach to content management systems. Today, I just hoping to have an open conversation about what this drift has looked like, what it means, and the advantages that are gained from taking this approach. And maybe specifically about how a tool like Gatsby and how something like Strapi and Oracle Content Experience provide their own specific advantages within that space. For those of you watching, we have a comment stream on the right-hand side of the video, so feel free to ask questions, and Rob and I will do our best to keep an eye out on that and introduce them into the conversation. So maybe to start off, for anyone not familiar, maybe directed towards Pierre from Strapi. I mean, what is a headless CMS? What is it that somebody like Strapi is really bringing to building modern web applications in this space?
Okay, thanks a lot, Chad. So headless CMS is a content management system without a front end. So this is why it is headless, without the visible part of the CMS. So in a traditional CMS, you really have two parts. You have the admin panel to manage the content, and the front end, which is the visible part of the website. And this is actually our traditional CMS's work. And a few years ago, a new kind of device appeared, and the content now has not only to be displayed on websites, on desktops, but also on mobile applications or any other device. And even the way to create a website drastically changed over the past few years. Front-end developers prefer to use modern technologies such as React, Vue.js, or Angular. And all of these technologies are designed to request the content from an API and to display it their own way. So the very big shift we've seen over the past few years is that the traditional CMS market is really shifting to the headless CMS approach, which means the front end and the back end are separated. So that's basically what is a headless CMS. And so instead of the front end, there is an API which makes the content available to any of this platform.
And taking this approach really assists with the challenge of delivering to this drastic amount of mobile devices and different kinds of devices that need access to that content.
Exactly. And you manage the content in one single tool, and it's completely omnichannel, so you don't have to duplicate the content across different devices.
Right.
One thing I would add to what Pierre was saying just now is that there's also a notion of using a CMS or a headless CMS as a content service. There's a term that emerged a couple of years ago, about 4 or 5 years ago, called content as a service. And it's really this idea of leveraging your content in your CMS and exposing that content anywhere and everywhere. And Pierre just illustrated really well both the fact that we have this amazing growth in the number of channels and digital experiences that we have to serve, as well as the front-end developer experience having changed in an incredible way over the last few years. And all of these things are pointing to a reinvention of the CMS as a monolith to something much more broken up into interesting pieces.
That makes sense. I mean, any other advantages maybe on not just providing content in this way, but maybe the performance advantages that you get from taking this approach? I mean, that you have a tool like Gatsby that really changes when request to an external service like this is called to your build step, so that most of this overhead isn't put onto the user, but then you do have this great advantage of separate service and content streams from other people. I don't know if you could speak to that, Dustin.
Yeah, no, I think that's one of the great advantages of Gatsby. So kind of my philosophy with Gatsby and our philosophy at Gatsby is like what can be built ahead of time should be built ahead of time. And, content from WordPress, Drupal, Strapi, we are not opinionated. The idea is that source that content at build time, let servers do the hard work, and then don't offload that cost to the end user. So, I mean, there's an end user performance impact, and there's also like a huge impact in costs and spend. So by not using Drupal for hosting or not using WordPress for hosting and using a CDN for hosting, your end user gets a much better experience and you save a lot of money in the process.
You're saving everything for this build. So really your application is serving this static content to begin with. So it's a tremendous, cost advantage in that way. And reading up on some of what you're doing, I think there's an article about like the 3 basic primary advantages of Gatsby. One of them is not just changing content delivery from these different channels, but restricting, let's say, libraries that you need for particular routes, that you're going to have bundling for this compiled application that is always intelligent about the fact that we want the fewest amount of resources as possible for every page that you're serving.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's great. I have a blog post somewhere on gatsbyjs.org that kind of goes into like what Gatsby does and why Gatsby is really performant by default. What you're referring to is route-based code splitting. So for instance, like my classic example is think of like a contact route. You might have like a contact library, so in the React space might be Formic, might be React Forms, what have you. You don't need that library on every single route. You just need it on the contact page. And so really with Gatsby, we try to make like the right thing, the easy thing. And you don't have to be a performance expert to get like a well-performing application.
That itself like add this additional advantage to the decoupled approach, that it's like you're setting up a situation where the overhead of getting started doesn't just remove this configuration expertise, but you're not reinventing any of these individual services in the previous case.
Yeah, I think the big benefit isn't so much in decoupling, although that is like a benefit. It's more of that you get like a better result. You get a better application as a result. And so by better, I mean a lot of things. I mean, it's faster. I mean, it's more secure. I mean, it's simpler. But the end user experience is that it loads faster. It loads faster on 3G. And so decoupling is a mechanism that feeds into Gatsby, where it stores data from anywhere. But the resulting application being performant is more of like Gatsby as a web framework, Gatsby as an app compiler.
Yeah, exactly. And also Gatsby is based on React, so you don't have a page reload between every page. So in terms of user experience, it's way faster. And also compared to the traditional approach, it's way easier to put a static website generator. So I mean, a static website generated behind a CDN. So that's easier to do, and you'll definitely get better performances compared to a traditional CMS. And also, if you take a look at the maybe more on the CMS side, scaling a traditional CMS is often very hard. None of them have been designed to scale horizontally across different instances. And this is something which is much more easier with this modern approach.
Absolutely. And there's something to be said about, you know, one of the things I often say is that potentially the CMS evolved a little too early, came into being a little too early, because the whole monolithic approach of a CMS where everything has to happen end to end, every layer is extricable from the others. And also the fact that, especially in Drupal, we know this from the Drupal world, where every single time you want to get a page out of Drupal, you have to go through, and you know, if it's not cached, you have to go through all the way and actually go through the entire bootstrap of Drupal to get a rendered page. And for the vast majority of users today, that's simply not workable because you're getting stale content in the case of extreme levels of caching, or you're just getting a really poor user experience because you're having to wait for every single page load. And that's one of the reasons why using a headless CMS like Strapi or Oracle Content Experience, or using headless Drupal in conjunction with some of these frameworks really allows for that clear separation to happen, that decoupling, as you mentioned, Chad, to happen in a way that allows for all of the considerations that we had around performance to be solely the concern of the client at this point and not the concern of the server. That actually means that you're no longer incurring any server latency when you use something like Gatsby or another Jamstack framework. You're not actually getting any sort of that latency being put on the user at the end of whatever they're trying to get. And as a result, this means that the way in which we're thinking about the CMS has to evolve completely. It's no longer possible for it to be a monolith. And as you can see from the really diverse names we have on this panel, everyone is very excited about this approach of headless CMS and really enabling the better performance that both Dustin and Pierre mentioned.
So I've got a question. So if any of the viewers who tuned in today were to Google Gatsby and just read what comes up on Google for that, it says blazing fast modern site generator. Okay, yet generator really sounds like something that's static, and Drupal and Strapi and WordPress are all dynamic websites where the actual detail and content can be transactional and changing minute by minute. How do you reconcile those two things? How do you reconcile a generated static site with a backend that's dynamic?
Yeah, so I can answer that a little bit. It's funny. Yeah, so Gatsby is the first result, but great, Gatsby is number 3. So that's good to know. But as far as your actual question, so Gatsby is a static site generator. Gatsby does produce static assets, and it does that very well. But once your client-side application is rendered to the user, then it's a regular React application. So it's a good blend. It's not just static. It's a blend of static and dynamic. And so that's why we say modern site generator. So we'll compile upfront what we can statically. So by static assets, I mean HTML, CSS, JavaScript. These can be deployed really easily, really cheaply, really securely on something like S3, and then you put a CDN in front of it, and effectively scales infinitely. And so the idea here is that static assets, I think, are the way the web should be built. Again, compile what you can, and then with Gatsby, it's not really a trade-off. It's not that it's just static. It's not that it's just dynamic. It's a good seamless blend of both. So for instance, if you need to do dynamic functionality, like you need to fetch comments, or you need to fetch, whatever, fetch something that makes your website more interactive, you can do that with existing tools in the React space, existing libraries, really, really easily. So that's kind of the blend and the mark we're trying to hit with Gatsby.
Anybody want to add to that?
Maybe the integration between headless CMSs and a static website generator like Gatsby. Mm-hmm. So as you say, the content is very dynamic. It is in a headless CMS. And most of the headless CMSs have a functionality which is webhooks. And so every time you are going to update the content in the headless CMS, it's going to ping the hosting provider of your front end. And this hosting provider is going to rebuild the website. So the Gatsby website, for example. So that way it stays quite kind of dynamic.
At what point? That sounds like a cache layer to me, though. At what point does the CMS change so much that the regeneration can't keep up? Does that happen?
Yeah. So basically what you're saying is like how rapidly updating of a CMS does Gatsby work with? And so if you're changing content like every second, the constraint there is the build time. So because we're compiling ahead of time, because we are basically constructing your Gatsby application in response to these outside events. So it's basically CMS sends a webhook on publish, Gatsby deployable with some continuous deployment solution, Gatsby Cloud, Netlify, Amplify, etc. The constraint there is how quick your build completes, and then also how quickly your content needs to be live. So for instance, if it's like a breaking news update and you have hundreds of them per day, Gatsby Cloud, Gatsby does work quite well for that situation, but ultimately our goal is for builds to be like seamless, obvious, and transparent. So in some sense, it's kind of like cache. I think of it more of like streaming updates. So streaming updates from CMS to a build service deploys to a CDN. Your end user is none the wiser, and they're not paying any cost. They're not waiting for that request to be rendered at runtime. They're getting it at build time, and it just works like you'd expect.
And one of the phrases that you just mentioned, Dustin, was really interesting. You said continuous deployment, which is a huge key term amongst a lot of developers today. And really what you're talking about in terms of allowing the CMS to stream content to Gatsby or Strapi, for example, to stream content, or Oracle Content Experience to stream content, is that you're forklifting a model that already exists in the development world. This model of every time I push a new commit to my GitHub repository or my code repository, that should trigger a new deployment of that code. We're just moving exactly the same principles that we've done in web development for the last couple of years over to the CMS world and saying, hey, when it comes to content governance and content delivery, that's the exact same kind of thing that should happen. Every time you update a piece of content in your CMS, whether it's Strapi, whether it's Drupal, whether it's the Oracle Content Experience CMS, you can actually have the same kind of model where you're actually doing continuous deployment of content as well. And that's one of the reasons why I think Gatsby in particular has gotten really popular, is because of these nice integrations with these CMSs that really approximate, or actually fundamentally are representing the notion of streaming content to a client.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why content as a service study makes sense, because if you take these acronyms, content management system should be only about managing content and obviously making it available. But if you take a look at all these traditional CMSs, they are not really content management system at the end. They are more than website builders. And that's why they are so complex. And making things really separated is exactly like maintaining a code-based approach. So it's much more maintainable in the long term.
That makes sense. Is there anything specific about Strapi of any other headless CMS option that is providing maybe a greater ease for being able to not just manage your content, but making it available either through your REST or through GraphQL as maybe the performance benefits that you get from providing that kind of data to something like Gatsby?
Yeah. So first of all, it's the API is a product in the product. It has to be very powerful. So having a REST API is fine. Offering also a GraphQL API is an advantage. So you can do that in Strapi through the plugin. And it's really useful because in a website, you have most of the time very complex data structure. So only if you are building a blog, for example, you want a list of blog posts and also the name of a tag. So you always have relations in content. So GraphQL can really help with this. And also having some filters to get only the data you want to have is something which is very powerful. So that's one thing about Strapi. And also we have other advantages. So Strapi is completely open source. So that means you are going to have the ability to host it on your own cloud infrastructure and to scale it. So you are going to have the ability to use any database. So it can be Postgres, MySQL, MongoDB, or SQLite. So depending on your needs, on your amounts of data, you are going to show the components of your choice. And that's quite a game changer in terms of speed of delivery.
Probably a great advantage of open source is you have this large community of people contributing to this plugin at the same time, or
Exactly.
to this technology at the same time. Yeah.
Exactly. So people contributing to the core product, but also contributing with plugins to extend the initial product. Strapi is based on the plugin system, and we really learned from WordPress, because what made the success of WordPress is not WordPress itself, but it's really the ecosystem of plugin around the product. And we really want to do the same with Strapi, offering a marketplace where any developer or any company can both publish or download any plugin.
Yeah, it's definitely one of our big advantages of our community as well. So we have like a pretty thriving plugin ecosystem. I love it. So we have like lots of community plugins. I think we're just about at 2,000 plugins now, which is pretty great. So there are different kinds of plugins in the Gatsby space. There's source plugins, which is very relevant what we're talking about today. So that's sourcing data from anywhere, including a CMS, could be Markdown, could be MDX, like you name the like source of data, and Gatsby can usually support it. It's the community is an excellent thing. I lovingly refer to it as like GitHub fire hose. We get so many contributions to Gatsby that it's like hard to keep track, but it's awesome having that community, and it's awesome having their help building out excellent web experiences.
Yeah, having too many contributors is a good problem to have.
It is, yeah.
A very good problem, because I think one of the things that's really interesting about plugin ecosystems as well is just how quickly they can rise and fall. I think we see this borne out in the Drupal ecosystem as well, where a lot of modules that formerly have been very instrumental in implementing some of these headless CMS architectures are potentially not as well maintained because people move on to other things. And so I think there is a little bit of risk in that as well. I think, open source or closed source, there's definitely risk in both. One of the things that I find interesting about Drupal, for example, is that a lot of folks have been very sad about the way that the GraphQL plugin in Drupal has changed, just because they've made a lot of different changes to the way that GraphQL works in Drupal. And as a result, anything that's relying on production, in production on those sorts of plugins will definitely have a little bit of a harder time. There's definitely arguments in favor of having a huge amount of plugins in a large plugin ecosystem. There's also arguments in favor of a more centralized approach where you have your full feature set available, just like an Oracle content experience, which we call OCE or CX content. And
that's a great lead into my question, Preston. I wanted to give you the floor to actually really talk about that system, because it's completely new to me. I've never seen it in my life. It's proprietary, so it kind of falls off the radar for me. What's it like to use? And I mean, you're coming from the open source world, and what's it like to use proprietary?
Well, I think it's really interesting to think about my journey has been very unique. I've definitely moved from open source to a bit more of a proprietary ecosystem lately, and there's benefits to both. One of the things that I find that's really nice about Oracle Content Experience is one of the biggest issues with open source tools like Drupal is that you don't have a lot of the tools that you need to run a full editorial workflow, or to do certain things like integrating with a DAM system, or integrating with other systems that you need to make sure to incorporate. One example that I see coming up very often, I know Dustin and I have talked a lot about this at Gatsby, and I know that Pierre has dealt with this at Strapi as well, is what happens when you need to integrate two very disparate systems, let's say a commerce system and a content system, right? You have to rely on two very different kinds of ecosystems in order to make this work. What's a really good benefit about a centralized system like Oracle Content Experience is that everything that you need, whether it's a video layer, a video system, whether you need a DAM system, if you need, let's say, machine learning recommendations for your content, or if you need things that are really ancillary to the core CMS experience, but are still extremely important to those who are working on large enterprise websites or very, very mission critical websites. One of the things that I know is a big struggle for a lot of CMSs is how do we enable some of these really amazing tools that we've gotten in the past, some of these things like a digital asset management system that are fully integrated into our product, to be just as robust for a headless CMS context. And that's one of the most challenging obstacles that I think a lot of the more legacy or traditional CMSs like Drupal and WordPress have is, well, first of all, Drupal doesn't really even have a DAM system, but if you look at the fact that a lot of the ways in which we've architected the CMS and the ways we've architected the infrastructure underlying the CMS really doesn't lend itself to the fact that people in these days, especially marketing teams, really want that fully integrated, cohesive experience. So when you have a system where, in like Drupal, for example, the commerce systems have evolved over time. In the past, we used something called UberCart. Now we'll use something called Drupal Commerce. Many people are now using things like Snipcart. Those sorts of evolutions are things that are made much more challenging when you have to seek out those plugins yourself. But it's also, of course, illustrating the fact that there's kind of that double-edged sword. You've got the benefit of the ecosystem to rely on any plugin that you can possibly imagine, but then you also have to think about the maintainability and longevity of that plugin.
Yeah, of course, and it is a lot of work, but I think it's not really a matter of being open source. It's really a matter of governance behind the open source project. So in any open source community, you will have tons of plugins that are now maintained over time, and that's a thing, and it will happen in any community. But if you really have lots of people behind the open source project, probably behind a company, which is the main sponsor of the open source project, then all of these people are going to make sure that both the internal APIs of the open source product and also the core plugins are going to be maintained time over time. So for me, it's not really a problem with open source itself, because we can manage both. And if you take a look at some very successful open source companies like GitLab, like Elastic, all of these products are really reliable. And also, it's not only a matter of being open source, but it's also because you're talking about integrating services all together. And most of the CMSs, which are open source, and most of the existing open source tools are focused on one single thing. So that's why they are not as easily integrated with others. But still, thanks to the plugin system, you can really easily integrate to other services, especially if the maintainer of the plugin is the external service itself. So if you take a look at Magento, for example, which is maybe the most maintained open source CMS, because there is a big business behind it. All of the payment system, for example, are maintained, and they are maintained by people, Stripe, and so on, because the external services have a real interest in this, because it brings us a lot of business. And I think it can be the same with the headless CMSs, and typically with Snipcart. Snipcart is a really good integration with headless CMSs to add the e-commerce section on top of headless CMS. And it's so important for Snipcart to maintain their plugin in the main headless CMSs that they will work on it, and they will make sure it's maintained, because otherwise they keep their own business. So I think it's really why a plugin system in an open source community is maintained time over time. It's because businesses have an economic interest in this.
And Pierre, you raised a really interesting point here that I definitely want to call out, because Dustin and I have spoken about this in the past. When we move from these more closed open source ecosystems, which is a bit of an oxymoron, where you have all these plugins that only work with Drupal PHP or WordPress PHP, to an environment where with a front-end framework like Gatsby, paired with a headless CMS, you get this amazing access to not only the limited set of plugins that are in your own ecosystem, but third-party plugins that can be supported in JavaScript, like Snipcart, like Typeform, all of these things that really lend themselves well to actually having your page become a set of interchangeable services that you can plug and play.
Exactly. It's an abstraction.
Exactly. It's an idea that I call the distributed CMS on my blog at Preston.sh. And it's a really interesting idea of being able to say, hey, the CMS is not just about a single kind of content layer anymore. It's about all of these different pieces that fill out the front end as well.
Exactly. And especially with things like graphical schemas that can be linked all together and mixed into a single one. And this is what Gatsby does with the Gatsby source plugins, but there are also some other solutions that can do that. You can just have a total abstraction of what is behind the request. And as a developer, you just don't care. It works, you get the data you want, and it's fine. And I think this is going to be a big trend over the next years.
Yeah, I mean, you're both leading into why Gatsby is Gatsby, so that's really, really great. So this unified layer of data is GraphQL and Gatsby, and so like we call it content mesh. Preston calls it distributed CMS. The idea is pull data from everywhere, stitch it together with GraphQL and Gatsby, and yeah, I think it's a really, really powerful pattern, and it kind of does speak to that notion Preston was kind of referring to about like whether you know, when you have this like one entity and like multiple sources, you know, you can occasionally have like a bad experience. With Gatsby, it's stitch them together, build out what you can at build time with GraphQL, and then really get the best experience of both worlds. So you know, you can use you can have a pretty good e-commerce experience with Gatsby with like Shopify or Snipcart. You can have a great content experience with Oracle CMS, or I'm sorry, Preston, or Strapi. And so, yeah, the idea is use whatever tools you like to be effective, stitch them together with Gatsby, and get an end user experience your users will love.
So Preston, we've got a question from Derek in the audience. He's asking, how do you address the question of vendor lock-in when you talk to people about OCE?
It's a great question. Currently, you know, Oracle and Oracle Content Experience, just kind of the way that we're thinking about the CMS market in general is shifting rapidly. Oracle Content Experience over the last several years has made a significant investment into headless CMS capabilities. We have a content delivery API, a content management API. Obviously, vendor lock-in is a big issue. And one of the things that you know, is a very strong tenet of the open source world is that you never want to lock in somebody. Drupal has benefited from a vast array of various migration utilities or means of exporting, importing content to other systems. And I know that a lot of other CMSs like Strapi have that kind of functionality as well. We're building in that functionality gradually into Oracle Content Experience. And one of the things that's going to be really nice about this kind of future of where Oracle is headed is that you're going to be able to use this data in many different places. So you don't get locked into a single kind of approach to rendering that data. But at the same time, you're also going to have the ability to import and export content to a variety of other systems that aren't just in the Oracle kind of purview. And that's a really exciting thing because Oracle historically, I think, hasn't been necessarily that friendly towards third-party technologies. And it's a really big shift that I'm seeing now that's really changing the way that we work with a lot of different technologies at Oracle.
Thanks. Chad, you want to ask another question?
Yeah, I guess one thing I was curious about is there any situation that you could see where taking this decoupled approach may not be the best solution for the application that you're trying to build? I mean, this is something that I've been playing around with recently, each one of your technologies, and as a relative newcomer to experimenting with things like this, could any of you think of a situation where this may not be the kind of approach that you might want to take to an application?
Sure. I'll start with this one. I can tell Pierre and Dustin have a lot to say here too, so I'll keep it short.
Go ahead.
You know, one of the things that I like to say about headless CMS is that it's something that has been born out of a significant amount of innovation in the developer experience. Pierre explained this really well at the start of this kind of live webcast. But one of the things that CMSs need to still handle is all of the things that Pierre classified as part of that website builder kind of milieu, right? And we know that the CMS is not really well equipped to remain a monolith. But the fact of the matter is that all of our marketing teams and all of our content editors still have all sorts of needs that they have. They have to do preview, they have to do editorial workflows, they have to approve previews, they have to preview unpublished content, they have to schedule content. And all of these things are extremely fundamental to the way enterprise content governance works. Unfortunately, one of the big problems with headless CMS right now, but I think is very, very actively being addressed by all of our respective teams, I'm sure at the moment, is how do we ensure that those who don't need to touch the code are still just as able to use the CMS as richly as they would have been able to use a CMS like Drupal or WordPress or monolithic Oracle Content and Experience. It's a really, really tough equation. And if you think also about the fact that a lot of the tools that we've built, as I mentioned earlier, like digital asset management, video management, a lot of these tools were intended for a monolithic CMS and weren't ever architected for a headless CMS environment. what does that mean to marketing teams when you tell them that they're about to lose 80, 90% of things that they use on a day-to-day basis? It requires a huge amount of coordination between the developer team and the marketing team to make this work. And with that, I'll let Pierre and Dustin take things.
I totally agree. And Chad, to answer your question, it's not a matter of use case, because you can build a super simple website or mobile application or anything else with a headless CMS and Gatsby or anything else. And you can also build something super complex. And for me, the limitation now is it's not about the use case, it's about the persona. With this separated approach, we added a lot of complexity, because now all of these things, are separated. So you have to connect them, and the only people who can connect them now are developers. So that's why we see that headless CMSs are used, especially for very custom projects. And this complexity, for me, is going to be resolved in the next few years. So the preview, the publication workflow, and all of these kind of things are going to be integrated in this new stack. And this is going to be improved in the next few years. And there is going to be some glue in between each part to make integrations very easier. So it's going to take a bit of time, but all of us are working on this, and we do our best to make things simple. And in 5 years, anyone will use a static website generator and the headless CMS, and they won't know they are using something like this, because it will be completely hidden, and everything will be about APIs, and it will be totally abstracted.
Yeah, I actually strongly agree with both of you. Preston, nothing you said there was contentious. I think it's important to, when anyone's like advocating for a tool, to like trust but validate. And so I'm also not going to come here and say this Gatsby is the like silver bullet for all of your solutions and will meet every single demand you may have. I think it's very important to be like very frank that the content editor's experience using something like Gatsby is not going to be 100% perfectly replicated with our current infrastructure. And so of course we're making headway on this, we're working towards this. And so it's a trade-off, like it's what workflows are you willing to sacrifice? What workflows do you really need to be successful? Do you really need all the workflows that you're getting with your quote unquote monolithic CMS? More often than not, I'd wager no, but if those are crucial for you and your team to be effective, Gatsby may not be the best choice for you right now. Now that isn't to say it might not be the best choice for you a year from now, 6 months from now. So it's always important to like revisit that discussion, because we are actively working on, getting that end user experience for not only the developer, which I think Gatsby is more targeted for now, but also the content editor, the marketer, the other personas that we want to capture as well.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that that I think is really a pressing concern. Is that we have a lot of people who are really used to particular workflows, and it may be that those workflows were incorrect, right? That those workflows, for example, in-place editing, in-context editing, where you're editing text directly in the CMS preview. I mean, this is a very easy problem to solve if you've got a monolith, but if you're building in a decoupled way with a headless CMS, it's an incredibly difficult problem to solve. I mean, some of the things that we've talked about at Gatsby, and I'm sure you've talked about at Strapi, Pierre, these are very, very significant challenges. However, I do want to caution us from saying that the marketing teams should potentially sacrifice some of their workflows. I think there are some marketing teams that certainly are interested in that. But I think there's also some modicum of saying, well, maybe developers also need to consider that their sites need to work really well with CMSs. What does that look like? Because it doesn't look like hard-coded menus. It doesn't look like hard-coded routes. It doesn't look like some of the things that a lot of developers do to make their experience better. And that's just about the compromise between marketers and developers.
That wasn't exactly what I was saying, but I do agree with that too. More what I was saying is that it's like more of a judgment call. It's, are you willing to compromise on this? Do you truly need that workflow? And so it's opening the discussion. It's not saying go do it this way, it's better. It's a discussion that I would urge, the developers and the marketers and the web teams that have been assembled to like have that discussion.
Let's take an example from the audience. David's asking if you would use Gatsby to build a site like Stack Overflow today. So let's take that as a thought experiment. From the Gatsby level, would you build a site like Stack Overflow with Gatsby? Would the build times be okay? Would it be the right tool in general?
No, it would not be the right tool. So Stack Overflow has millions of like probably like tens of millions of comments of articles of things that are like rapidly changing. And so that is a level that we are not capable of scaling to today. I would caution, how many people are truly Stack Overflow scale? How many applications are truly Facebook scale? Few and far between. But again, it's important to choose the right tool, and Gatsby is not scalable to millions of pages with like real-time edits like that currently. And so you could deliver an experience like this. You could fetch the data at runtime, but I don't think that's necessarily the best user experience. So something like Stack Overflow, not necessarily the best choice for a tool like Gatsby today.
Okay, thanks. Let's rule Gatsby out for a moment and look at the other three CMSs that we have collective expertise with. So CMSs. So I used the term again, but Oracle Content and Experience, Drupal, Strapi IO. Would any of those systems be an appropriate tool in building a modern Stack Overflow?
So I can answer for Strapi, and the answer is you could. You could definitely. And the reason behind this is that because at the beginning, Strapi was not a CMS. When we built Strapi, so it was in 2015, and we made Strapi because Aurélien, Jim, and I, my two other co-founders, were building a lot of APIs. And with always the same problematics, which are authentication, connection to the database, and so on and so on. So at the beginning, Strapi was a Node.js framework with an admin panel. And 2 years ago, we decided to become a headless CMS and to really focus on this content management use case. So that's why now we consider Strapi as a headless CMS. And the reality is that Strapi is still very flexible. You can scale it on tens of servers. You can use it with any database. So technically you can do it. If you really want to become something as big as Stack Overflow, maybe you should choose something even more scalable. But technically you could, but maybe you should still use something else.
All right, thanks. And Preston, I'm going to hire you right now to build me a new Stack Overflow. What do you use?
Well, I think that it's a very interesting question that you posed. You posed the same question to Gatsby and to the headless CMSs. I think it's not so much a matter of the choice. Well, it is definitely a matter of the choice of CMS, because you want to have APIs that are performant and APIs that are going to incur the least amount of latency for your request. But most importantly is how exactly are you getting the data out, right? Because Stack Overflow is not what I would consider a, let's say, complex content model from the standpoint of our typical CMS use cases like newspapers, magazines, or so on and so forth. It's more a kind of comment system, and it's more of a kind of, you could very feasibly use a key value store, for example, for something like that. But the key issue here is not so much the underlying CMS, because I think here the CMS is really about, okay, you've got the APIs that are really great, you've got your content store. What's really going to determine the success of your new Stack Overflow is going to be everything that comes past that point, right? How are you going to be serving your data? Are you going to be caching your responses? Are you going to be caching GraphQL queries? Are you going to be doing things like producing static JSON as endpoints instead of an actual API that might be less performant, right? Also further on, are you going to be using a CDN? What's your level of staleness that you can handle? What's your level of cacheability? I mean, these are all things that are extremely crucial. And I think the question is, can you build a Stack Overflow at Stack Overflow scale? That's the real question. And that's this question that involves much more than just the CMS. But if you're asking, can you build a Stack Overflow right now with, let's say, a modicum of a reasonable amount of users at the moment, I would say absolutely any of our systems would be very well positioned for that. Of course, so I'm going to say
devil's in the detail with the scale. Yeah, scaling's a problem. Pierre, there's a bit of some fear, panic, terror evolving in the comment chat on YouTube about the Strapi beta tag. When's the stable release coming? And can you name some sites right now that are in production with Strapi so we can get some assurance that it's for real?
Yeah, sure. There is an entire section of IBM.com which is powered by Strapi. There is also collision.com, which is a website made by Asos. and lots of other very big companies, and especially insurances, banks all over the world. So it's definitely used in production. And yes, Strapi is still in beta, and the stable version is going to be released in May. So
famous last words.
A matter of weeks. Just a matter of weeks. We know our users are waiting for this, so we are almost there.
Thanks. Chad, what's our next question?
I think that what I have here is maybe directed at Preston. And it is interesting to me reading some of your articles on your blog that this movement doesn't just, this direction doesn't just call attention to the use of headless CMS, but also the use of multiple content streams together at the same time in a single application, which I found very interesting, and how that wasn't, that solving that problem previously came with so much aggravation potentially for the developer of getting all of these API queries together in that application, and how with something like Gatsby, because of the way that the source plugin system works, that you're essentially setting your configuration, writing how you're going to handle GraphQL, for example, inside your application. And that's essentially it. It's handled at build time, and you have access to all those calls together. I mean, maybe it might be interesting for some other people to talk about like why this problem has been potentially so difficult for developers in the past, and what makes it different now.
Sure. Since a lot of us are Drupal folks on the call, let me rewind to about, let's say, 15 to 10 years ago. Drupal, back in the day, a lot of people used Drupal as that centralized data source of every single possible thing. You know, we used feeds module, for example, to import a whole bunch of data from, let's say, Salesforce or a CRM system or whatever other system you might have. But the problem with that kind of approach is that now you have to put everything into Drupal and now handle everything as if it was coming out of Drupal, which might not be so great if you're somebody who's really used to, let's say, you know, a Magento API, for example. And if you're putting all of that into Drupal, now you got to learn how to use things in Drupal. And, you know, over the course of time, it became very clear that approaches like the feeds module, things like that, weren't really a very good use case for unifying disparate data together. One of the nice things about Gatsby, as you mentioned, is this notion of tying data together. And I think this is really rooted in the kind of fundamental philosophy that GraphQL has espoused, which is GraphQL is really about flattening all of the differences that are existing between the data models that might be present across disparate systems. One example of this is, you know, Gatsby, for example. I use Gatsby on my personal site, and I think I know what blog post you're referring to. It's the consuming multiple CMSs with Gatsby. And it's not a use case that's 100% common, but I think it's definitely a use case that was very valid for me, because I said, well, I've already got 2 CMSs I'm using. I don't want to just add a third one and have to recreate all of this. So let me just add a third one into the mix. Because Gatsby doesn't have any kind of latency incurred from any of that work retrieving that data, and it's all about the static files that are ultimately rendered, you don't actually incur any latency from having multiple CMSs in your architecture. And by using that single unified GraphQL API that's present in Gatsby, you really don't see much of a difference apart from, let's say, some of the nomenclature or some of the ways that the data structure looks, where it's serialized. You can just kind of say, hey, I'm just going to use my single unified GraphQL API within Gatsby, or within React, let's say if you're using Apollo, to retrieve my data from all of my different sources and use Drupal, Contentful, and Oracle Content Experience in one fell swoop and have data from 3 different systems in one location. And that's a very compelling use case for technologies like Gatsby. And it really lends a lot of credence to this notion of what Dustin called the content mesh, or what I call the distributed CMS, which is this notion of, hey, you know, you really don't need to have everything in one single source of data, one single server that's going to muck up all sorts of things for performance down the line.
And presumably it would give you the flexibility to choose a certain CMS for a particular type of content that it may be better suited for handling. Or yes. I think you also mentioned in that article that simply in the fact of being able to rely on multiple content sources in this way, that you get a little bit of added security from the fact that they are so distributed that if one should be compromised, that doesn't mean that the whole site's going to go down. It's not going to influence these other sources of content in your final application.
Exactly, and that's one of the things that makes Gatsby so fail-safe, right? Is that even if your CMSs go offline, even if, let's say, Strapi goes offline, Oracle Content Experience goes offline, Drupal goes offline, your Drupal instance goes offline, you still have your content there. It's just still right there.
Sure.
And one of the things that I think is really important to note here as well, though, is that this is a current need that a lot of people have. This is an actual current requirement. About 5 years ago, I worked at Time Inc., which is one of the biggest magazine publishers in the world. And one of their key websites had to consume two very different kinds of data, right? There was one that was content, so it was primarily editorial content. And then in this case, there were also scoreboards from various sports kind of key value stores that were giving scores and win-loss records, that sort of thing. And these all had to be put into a single place. Their original implementation put all of this stuff into Drupal. And if you think about it, Drupal's relational databases aren't necessarily the best fit for things like scoreboard data. That's really a better fit for something like MongoDB, and that's why we need to figure out a way to flatten all those differences and figure out a way to make it so that, hey, from the developer standpoint, it should be indistinguishable whether or not you're consuming from a particular data store with a particular format or a different serialization. It shouldn't matter to you as a developer. It should just be one single API. And I cut you off, Pierre, sorry.
I mean, that's completely correct, especially if the CMS has any downtime or can be any external API. So obviously, this is very true with the static website generator, which is typically behind the CDN. It can also be true with the dynamic app, which consume different APIs. And if you have a very good cache system, and if this cache system cannot get the request or get a 500 or an error like this, it will display the old page instead of requesting a new one. So this is something which is completely true, but it is also true that if you have a dynamic website with a very good caching system, you can still get all of the benefits of the cache and having your CMS which is down without having the website down. So that's it, I think.
We had a question from the audience, or rather somebody lobbed a keyword over the fence. Serverless. Do any of the systems we're discussing today have a good serverless story, or is that happening in a different part of the universe altogether?
Yeah, happy to speak about it. I think there are lots of things about serverless. There are two main things. There is really function as a service, which is the typical serverless approach. And for me, even things like Kubernetes, where the server management is completely abstract, it's also kind of serverless. So with Strapi, we are not compatible with things like AWS Lambda, so function as a service, but having something which is completely serverless and easy to deploy on platforms as a service or things like Kubernetes.
Platform.sh.
Of course. It's something we are 100% compatible with. So that's for us. And also, even it's sometimes a bit misunderstood, online, fully hosted CMSs like SaaS sometimes are considered as serverless. I mean, it's not really what is serverless in the tech world, but what is sure is that people talking about this do not want to manage any server. So this is something we don't do at the moment. We will do in the future.
I have another question of my own. Dustin, when Gatsby builds and it uses GraphQL to pull in all of the information that it needs from its data backends, that makes it pretty dependent, the build time, on the actual performance of the data backend, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's coupled. We will cache as much as we can upon subsequent builds, but yeah, it is like in some sense API constrained. And one thing we're kind of actively working on now is like benchmarking of different types of CMSs truly
Ooh.
know which ones are slower than others.
So who is it? Who are the cheetahs and who are the dogs?
Smaller sample size right now, so not a lot of data to infer quite yet, but sooner rather than later, we'll know more about that. So, but yeah, it's a very real thing. Yeah, bad APIs lead to slower build times for sure.
So you'll be publishing actual data about your benchmarks about backends?
Yeah, at some point in the future, we will be doing something quite like that.
I want to subscribe to that.
One thing to note as well is that, one of the things that Gatsby does, and this was there during my time as well, is that, Gatsby has integration partners. And one of the kind of requirements, the thresholds to exceed is to have your responses or have the CMS respond within, what is it, 5 seconds, right, Dustin? It's something like that.
Yeah, 5 seconds is what we call like a first class integration.
Yeah.
That's kind of slow, but that's all of the data for the request, right? That's not just one like piece of content. That's like a million pieces of content.
I mean, 5 seconds is the ceiling, not the floor. So it's like, yeah, but it's a fair call out. Here's what we were talking about earlier about workflows. It's like, what level of workflow are you willing to work in? So for instance, changing a blog post, having it up on the side, like obviously you want milliseconds because that's effectively what a lot of solutions right now have. And so most edits are around a second or so. So you kind of change content, see it reflected live. The better CMSs or the ones that are quicker, the ones that work more, I think, better with Gatsby, they're effectively like instantaneous. So it's a good way that you can kind of pick and choose on, what level of eventuality are you willing to like effectively deal with. But yeah, 5 seconds is our ceiling that we ask for integrations.
So we've just had a viewer who basically called us out for having no females here. We discussed that minutes before going live and slapped ourselves on the wrist. Sorry for that. Contact me if you have suggestions for guests for the future episodes of this show. Happy to correct for that and get diversity of all kinds on the show. Every voice matters to us. No, error. You're saying it was a joke, but I actually take it seriously. So don't take it back. To the panelists, we're up on 3 minutes before we cut off. Any topics that we missed? Nothing?
We talked just a little bit about security, but one good thing with the Jamstack is that things are really separated, and most of the security issues that were in the traditional CMSs were in the template system. But now, because things are separated, the only thing you can hack is the API of the headless CMS, and hopefully it is secured because it is really predictable. Whereas the functions exposed in the templates in traditional CMSs are a bit less secure, so that's also a good advantage.
Yeah, and that's one of the biggest advantages that Jamstack technologies like Gatsby provide. Is that one of the really nice things about this is that you can build your site, you can build your Gatsby site using a headless CMS like Strapi, Drupal, and then you can shut down your CMS. You can make that API go away, and you can make the entire editorial layer go away because your content is still intact, and you can resurrect the CMS whenever you need to get that content back out and update some content. But fundamentally, this is one of the biggest problems with the Drupal security, for example, or WordPress security, is that because you constantly have servers running with these CMSs as applications that have to be constantly running, you're going to have a lot of security vulnerabilities that are introduced because of that. And attackers can really easily penetrate these sorts of CMSs that are very popular. We see this borne out every single week in Drupal with new security advisories. But the nice thing about this model is that you can have a completely airtight, secure site with something like Gatsby, where you're not actually there's nothing in the resulting Gatsby build that has any dependency on any CMS that's running, which is great.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, everybody. We are up against the hour of broadcast that we targeted. I want to thank all of you awesome guests for joining, and it was a very lively discussion. I learned a ton myself. It makes me want to go try all of your systems. I want to call out to the audience to join us on the Platform.sh webinar series that's coming up. We will be launching a mini series, 3 episodes on fleets of websites for people who have dozens, hundreds, even thousands of websites that they're managing. And we have some specific thoughts about that, and that might be helpful to you. And would also love your suggestions about future topics for Deploy Friday. That said, it is Friday. Now I want you to all go out and deploy something today. Thanks so much, and tune in next time.
See ya.
Thank you everyone for coming.
Bye.
Thanks all.